So the step-by-step method that we've been using in our exercises so far also applies to complex paintings like portraits, and that's what we're going to be moving on to today. This video is going to show you how to set up your workspace and how to go through the first step, laying down base colors, for a portrait. Make sure that you download the portrait file that I've provided the link to. We're going to be using that throughout the lesson. So when you first open the file, you'll see there's line art already drawn for you. There's a group called Reference Materials. Inside is the line art, and the line art's set to multiply and 23% opacity. There's a black and white version of the reference that we'll be using at the beginning. There's also a color version that we'll use when we get to the color stage. So you can keep that reference material on top of everything else that we do. So if you're wondering how I made that line art, I used a fairly common shortcut, which is to just put the picture on another layer and then literally trace the lines over top so that you know where things go. Some people might consider that cheating, and it's certainly better to be able to draw your own, but this is not really a drawing assignment, and so it's a shortcut that will save us some time. So the first thing we're going to have you do is add a new layer inside the reference material group, and we're going to call this palette. And what I want you to do with a brush set to 100% opacity is to select a range of grays that we're going to use for our image. You want to select from as far to the left as you can so there's no color. And we're going to take a 25% gray, a 50%, 75%, and a pure black. So we'll have 4 different grays painted onto that palette layer. This will allow us to sample them really quickly while we're painting. So now we're getting to the point where we're ready to paint in our base value. Now a lot of artists will separate the face from the hair, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make separate base value layers for both. So in painting in the base values, you want to make sure that your brush is a hard-edged brush, and you want to make sure that your opacity is 100%, and that you've selected your 50% gray. Usually I use a smaller brush and zoom in when I'm doing the parts near the lines, because that's where you need to be the most careful. When you're filling in the rest of the inside, you can just pick quite a large brush and fill that in quickly. You want to paint right up to the line for the face and the neck, so all the flesh stuff, and up to the edges of the hair at the top. This is where having a tablet will really pay off. Even if you are using a tablet and not a mouse, you're still going to go outside the lines occasionally, so it's useful to know the shortcuts E and B. E will switch immediately to your eraser, so you can remove places where you went over the lines, and B switches back to your brush. Make sure you don't just paint up to the line and then stop. You also want to make sure you're painting under the lines as well. You'll be able to see that area darken as you paint under it. If you just paint up to the line, then when we turn the line art off, which we're eventually going to do, you're going to have leftover white spaces there. When you're done, take a look for any little gaps that you may have missed. I noticed a little one here because anything that's left white, you will not be able to put shadows or highlights over when we make clipping masks. Let's just take a moment to explain why that happens. When you make a clipping mask, it preserves the transparency of the layer that it's attached to. So if you've got a little gap in your base layer, then when you go to add your shadows and highlights, none of them will appear over top of that hole because it's transparent on your base layer, so the clipping mask won't allow you to paint there. If you're wondering why I didn't add the ear to the base value of the face, it's because the ear is very, very fuzzy and fades into the hair, so there's no sharp lines and it would be better to make it part of the hair layer. So the next step is to make a new layer for the hair, and you can call it hair base value or something like that. And we want the hair to be in behind the face because most of the edges of the face are in front of the hair. In the lesson here, I didn't move my layer behind the face until after I was done painting. You don't have to be quite as careful with the edges on the hair because the outside edge of the hair tends to be a little wispy and fuzzy anyway, and the inside edge is going to be behind the face. So get reasonably close to the edges, but don't worry too much about shrinking to a small brush and being really exact. One thing you do have to be really careful to check is that there's no gaps between your hair and the face. And that's pretty much it for step 1. Your base layers are now set, and we're ready to move on to step 2, which is blocking in highlights and shadows. Save your work at this point.